The Trial of the Worthy. The grand hall of the Temple of Vaelthar was bathed in a golden glow, the air thick with incense and ancient power. The temple, carved from obsidian rock, had stood for thousands of years, waiting for the one who was worthy. Before the towering altar lay the Vaelthar, the sacred sword of the Xal'nari, an ancient relic said to choose its own wielder. Its blade shimmered as though it were alive, reflecting the faces of the many warriors gathered in the chamber. Today, the greatest warriors from across the galaxy had come to prove their worth. The Xal'nari Seers, dressed in flowing silver robes, watched from above, their glowing eyes filled with anticipation. Lucas Grant stood at the back of the chamber, unnoticed. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a human, an outsider, a mere observer. He had been invited out of courtesy, not expectation. He adjusted the strap of his worn-out leather jacket, his sharp eyes watching the ritual unfold. The Xal'nari believed in destiny, in champions foretold by the stars. Lucas. He believed in his own two hands and the decisions he made. Fate had never been kind to him, and he had learned not to trust it. At the center of the hall, a massive alien warrior stepped forward. "I am Xal'vek, warlord of the Vorka Empire. I claim the sword." Xal'vek was a towering beast of muscle and scars, standing almost 9 feet tall. His crimson skin gleamed under the temple's light, his 4 arms flexing as he marched forward. If there was anyone who looked like they deserved the blade, it was him. The Seers nodded, granting him permission. Xal'vek took a deep breath, then reached for the Vaelthar. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, a shockwave of energy exploded from the sword, knocking him back. The hall shook as if the temple itself was rejecting him. The blade remained still, refusing his touch. A murmur spread through the crowd. Lucas exhaled. So much for the mighty warlord. One by one, the other champions stepped forward. A reptilian knight from the Serati clans. A cybernetic warrior with glowing blue veins. A shadowy assassin who moved like a ghost. Each of them failed. The sword refused them all. The tension in the room thickened. The Seers exchanged puzzled glances, their ancient eyes filled with confusion. For the first time in history, the blade rejected all champions. Lucas shifted, uncomfortable. Something felt wrong. Why wouldn't the sword choose anyone? He stepped forward slightly, his curiosity growing. Maybe he was imagining it, but something about the sword called to him. The moment his foot brushed against the stone platform, the sword reacted. A low hum filled the air. A pulse of energy rippled from the blade, spreading through the chamber like a silent thunderclap. The golden light of the temple flickered, as if responding to an unseen force. Lucas froze. No. That wasn't possible. The warriors turned toward him, their expressions shifting from frustration to something far worse. Suspicion. Lucas swallowed hard. Oh, hell. The Vaelthar sword lifted itself, its tip hovering just inches above the platform. The energy around it grew stronger, swirling like a storm. Then, slowly, the blade tilted toward Lucas. Xal'vek snarled. What trickery is this? The Seers gasped, their glowing eyes locked onto the scene. Never, in the history of the Xal'nari, had the sword chosen a human. Lucas took a step back. No. This had to be a mistake. But the sword pulsed again. This time, it moved toward him. The crowd erupted in chaos. This is an insult, one alien roared. He is unworthy, shouted another. The sword has chosen incorrectly. Lucas's heart pounded. He had spent his life surviving in the darkest corners of the universe, scraping by on instinct and skill. He was a wanderer, a nobody. Why would an ancient weapon choose him? The Seers spoke in hushed tones, their expressions unreadable. Then, the High Seer raised his staff, silencing the room. The sword does not make mistakes, he said. The human must step forward. Lucas clenched his jaw. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be here. But the Vaelthar was still moving toward him, waiting for him to claim it. He had two choices. Walk away, and forever be remembered as the man who rejected destiny. Or step forward. And face whatever came next. Lucas took a deep breath. Then, with steady hands, he reached for the sword. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, the chamber exploded in light. Chosen against all odds. Lucas Grant's world vanished in a blinding surge of light. For a single breath, he felt nothing, no ground beneath his feet, no air in his lungs. Just an endless white void stretching into eternity. Then, in an instant, the temple snapped back into focus. The energy coursing from the sword flared outward, sending cracks splintering across the obsidian floor. Statues crumbled, pillars shook, and the sacred altar trembled beneath his feet. The crowd erupted in chaos. Impossible. He tricked the sword. A human is unworthy. Lucas barely heard them. His pulse hammered in his ears, his grip on the hilt tightening. The Vaelthar sword felt alive in his hands, vibrating like it had been waiting an eternity to be held again. And then, a voice, no, a memory, whispered through his mind. You are the last. Lucas stiffened. What the hell was that? Before he could react, a red blur lunged at him. Xal'nari. The alien warlord, humiliated and seething, roared like a beast as he rushed forward, his massive hands reaching to rip the sword away. Lucas reacted on instinct. He twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding the warrior's crushing grip. His body moved faster than it ever had before. His reflexes felt sharper, his senses heightened, as though the sword itself was guiding his every motion. Xal'nari snarled and swung again. Lucas lifted the sword just in time, steel met flesh, and the warlord reeled back, his forearm cut open by the blade's energy. Silence crashed over the chamber. The warriors stared. The seers stared. Even Xal'nari hesitated, looking down at his bleeding arm in shock. The Vaelthar had cut him. That should have been impossible. The Vorka were nearly invulnerable, their skin thicker than reinforced steel. No normal weapon could ever cut through them. But this wasn't a normal weapon. The seers whispered among themselves, their silver eyes filled with something new. Fear. The high seer raised his staff, his voice cold and commanding. Enough. The warriors fell silent. Lucas, still gripping the sword, forced himself to breathe, his mind racing. What had just happened? The high seer stepped forward, his long robes gliding across the floor. He studied Lucas carefully, as if seeing him for the first time. The Vaelthar has chosen. His voice echoed through the hall. And we must obey. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the warriors. Lucas could feel the hatred in their stares. They didn't want him. They wanted a hero, a warrior, someone worthy. And they saw him as nothing. But the sword had already decided. The high seer lifted his gaze to Lucas. You must prove yourself. Lucas tightened his jaw. Yeah. And what happens if I refuse? The seer's face hardened. Then the sword will take your life. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Lucas swallowed, glancing down at the weapon in his grip. His fingers flexed around the hilt. It felt natural in his hands, like it had been waiting for him. But that didn't mean he wanted any part of this. He had spent his whole life avoiding fights that weren't his. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had survived long enough to know that fate didn't give second chances. And yet, the sword had chosen him. Lucas exhaled. He was trapped. If he rejected the sword, it would kill him. If he accepted it, he would have to fight for it. He looked around the chamber, at the warriors who wanted him dead, at the seers who didn't trust him. He was alone in a sea of enemies. Well, wouldn't be the first time. Lucas gritted his teeth and lifted the blade. All right. He met the High Seer's gaze. What do I have to do? The High Seer turned, gesturing toward the warriors. You must survive. Lucas barely had a second to react before the first challenger stepped forward, drawing his blade. The battle had begun. The battle of honor. Lucas didn't have time to think. The moment the High Seer uttered the words, "You must survive," a warrior lunged at him. A blur of silver armor and flashing blades. Lucas barely got his sword up in time. Steel clashed against energy, sending a shockwave through his arms. He stumbled back, his grip on the Vaelthar tightening. His opponent, a Seers duelist, moved fast, his twin daggers a blur of motion. His scaled skin shimmered under the temple lights, his amber eyes filled with murderous intent. Lucas dodged left, barely. The next strike sliced the air where his throat had been a second ago. Damn! They weren't holding back. He barely had a second to react before the Seers warrior struck again, this time low. Lucas jumped back, his heart hammering. The temple floor shook beneath him, the energy of the Vaelthar sword humming in his grip. The alien smirked. You don't belong here, human. Lucas gritted his teeth. No kidding. He didn't know how to fight like this. Not with ritual combat, not with sacred weapons, not against warriors who had trained for this their whole lives. He was just a soldier. A survivor. A man who had made it through more bad situations than he could count. And right now, he was in another one. The Seers lunged again, moving faster than Lucas thought possible. He twisted the sword on instinct. The moment the Vaelthar met steel, the world slowed. Lucas saw the attack before it happened. He didn't understand it, but somehow, his body moved on its own, his arms flowing with the sword's energy. The Vaelthar blade met the strike with perfect precision. Sparks erupted. The force of impact sent the Seers skidding back. The alien warrior's smirk vanished. The crowd stirred. The Seers leaned forward. Lucas felt it too. Something was changing. This wasn't just a sword. It was alive. The Seers warrior snarled, his pride wounded. He rushed forward again, faster, angrier. Lucas didn't wait. He stepped into the attack, turning his blade at the last moment. The Vaelthar glowed with a deep golden energy. The Seers strike missed completely. Lucas's blade was already at his throat. The entire chamber fell silent. The alien warrior's chest rose and fell, his eyes wide with shock. He had never been outmatched like this. Lucas felt sweat dripping down his temple. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had moved too fast. Reacted too perfectly. Like the sword had taken over. The Seers whispered amongst themselves, their glowing eyes flickering with unease. Lucas kept his blade still. If he wanted, he could end this fight right now. He didn't. Instead, he took a step back, lowering the sword. The Seers hesitated. Then, slowly, he did the same. A warrior's surrender. The High Seer rose from his throne. His ancient face remained unreadable, but his voice rippled with something new. The sword guides him. Lucas barely had a second to process those words before a new voice boomed across the hall. Not good enough. The crowd parted. A shadow loomed over the chamber. Lucas turned, and his stomach sank. Xal'nari. The massive warlord stepped forward, his 4 arms crossing over his broad chest. The wound Lucas had given him earlier was already healing. His crimson skin gleamed under the temple lights, his eyes burning with rage. I will not bow to a human, Xal'nari growled. You fight me next. Lucas felt his grip tighten around the Vaelthar. This was going to be bad. The High Seer hesitated. Then, Slowly, he nodded. Very well. Lucas exhaled. One fight down. And now, he was about to face the strongest warrior in the temple. Cliffhanger for Part 4. The Buried Past. Lucas could still feel the Serati warrior's stunned gaze on him as he stepped away. His breath came slow and heavy, the weight of the Vaelthar sword still unfamiliar in his grip. The energy pulsing through the weapon felt like static in his veins, tingling, humming, almost whispering. But he had no time to dwell on it. Because Xal'vek was waiting. The warlord stood at the center of the chamber, his 4 arms flexing, his crimson skin glistening under the temple's sacred light. His heavy war axe rested on his shoulder, the edges crackling with energy. His gaze burned with pure hatred. Come, human, Xal'vek growled. Let me remind the galaxy of your place. Lucas swallowed. He didn't need a reminder. He already knew. Humans weren't warriors in this part of the universe. They weren't conquerors or champions. They were workers, traders, scavengers. No empire feared them. No army respected them. They were small. Forgettable. Weak. And yet, the sword had chosen him. Lucas exhaled, stepping forward onto the ancient battleground. The temple walls stretched high around them, the seers watching from above, their silver eyes unreadable. The duel began. Xal'vek moved first, a blur of crimson muscle and deadly precision. Lucas barely lifted his sword before the first strike slammed into him. Pain exploded across his ribs. He staggered, nearly losing his grip on the Vaelthar. Xal'vek didn't stop. He pressed forward, merciless, relentless. His axe came down in an arc meant to split Lucas in two. Lucas reacted on instinct. His body twisted, too fast, too smooth, like something else was controlling it. The sword in his hands shifted positions before he even thought to move it. Xal'vek's axe met the Vaelthar's glowing edge. The impact rippled through the temple. Stone cracked beneath their feet. The warlord's sneer faltered for a single second, and Lucas saw something flicker in his burning eyes. Doubt. Lucas pushed forward, feeling the energy of the sword coiling in his muscles, making his movements faster, his strikes sharper. It was like the blade was guiding him, showing him how to fight. But then, the vision hit. A flash of another world. A battlefield, covered in ash and fire. Warriors in shining armor, holding the same sword he now wielded. And among them, humans. Not scavengers. Not traitors. Warriors. Lucas gasped as reality snapped back. He had only been out for half a second, but Xal'vek had seen it. You hesitate, the warlord snarled. Lucas barely raised his sword before Xal'vek's massive fist slammed into his chest. He flew back, his body slamming against the stone wall. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, his vision blurring. Pain. Real, raw pain. He forced himself up. He had survived worse. Xal'vek marched forward, his axe dragging across the ground. You are no champion, human, the warlord spat. That sword should not be yours. Lucas exhaled, his fingers tightening around the Vaelthar's grip. The whispers in his mind grew louder. You are the last. Remember. The visions weren't random. They were memories. Not his. The swords. Lucas looked up at Xal'vek, his breath steady. He was no champion. No chosen warrior. But the Vaelthar had chosen him for a reason. And if he didn't figure out why, he was going to die. Xal'vek charged. Lucas raised the sword. The battle wasn't over yet. The return of the ancient enemy. The temple was silent. Xal'vek stood over Lucas, his massive form casting a shadow across the cracked stone floor. The warlord's 4 fists tightened, his expression unreadable. His warriors stood at the edges of the battleground, watching, waiting. Lucas, still breathing hard, tightened his grip on the Vaelthar. His body ached, bruises forming beneath his clothes. His ribs screamed with every breath. But the sword was still in his hands. He had survived. For now. The High Seer rose from his throne, his glowing silver eyes scanning the battlefield. The trial is over. A murmur spread through the temple. Some warriors still seethed in anger, but none dared challenge the seer's judgment. Lucas exhaled, forcing himself to stand. And then, the temple doors exploded. A deafening boom split the air. A shockwave of dark energy tore through the sacred chamber, sending warriors sprawling. Statues cracked, dust raining from above. Lucas barely had time to react before a figure stepped through the smoke. A figure that shouldn't exist. Tall. Cloaked in shifting shadows. Its form twisted in and out of reality, like it was only half there. And its eyes, deep and endless, looked straight at him. A single whisper slithered through the temple. "We have returned." The seers froze. The warriors stiffened. Even Xal'vek took a step back. Lucas felt it immediately, a presence so old, so deeply wrong, that the very air seemed to decay around it. The Xal'nari. The name rushed through his mind, even though he had never heard it before. The enemy of the forgotten war. The force that had once devoured entire civilizations. The reason the sword had been waiting. Lucas gripped the Vaelthar tighter. He didn't know how, but he understood one thing with absolute certainty. The war wasn't over. It was about to begin again. The warrior's legacy. The battlefield was burning. Ash and fire choked the air, the one sacred temple now reduced to ruins. The high walls had crumbled, their ancient carvings lost beneath shattered stone. The golden glow of the chamber had turned red, flickering in the haze of war. And at the center of it all, Lucas stood alone. His breath was ragged, his body broken. Blood, his and others, dripped from his torn sleeves, staining the ground beneath him. His grip on the Vaelthar sword was weak, the weight of it suddenly heavier than before. Across from him, the Xal'nari Overlord remained standing. Tall. Endless. A shifting void of shadows and malice. It had no face, only those two infinite eyes, staring straight into his soul. It had waited millennia for this moment. And so had the sword. Lucas knew now. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. The Vaelthar had been waiting for someone to remember. For someone to finish the war. The Overlord's voice slithered through his mind, cold and absolute. "You were forgotten for a reason." Lucas exhaled, his body screaming at him to stop. But he didn't. He lifted the Vaelthar one last time. And the sword answered. A pulse of golden energy erupted from the blade, cutting through the darkness, through the fire, through the lies that had buried humanity's past. The Vaelthar had never been just a weapon. It was a key. And Lucas was the lock. The Overlord lunged. Lucas swung. And the galaxy remembered. Final scene, the aftermath. The war was over. The temple was gone. The seers, the warriors, the last of the Ivari, they watched in silence. Lucas stumbled, his vision blurring. The Vaelthar, now dull and lifeless, slipped from his fingers. He had won. But victory came at a price. As he collapsed, he felt the sword's presence fading. Its purpose was complete. It would sleep again. Until the day another warrior would need it. Lucas smiled, just once, before the darkness took him. Final line. The blade will rest, until another warrior rises to claim it. The warrior's legacy. The sword was dying. Lucas could feel it, its power fading, the golden light flickering in his hands like a dying star. The once mighty Vaelthar, the blade that had chosen him, the weapon that had defied the will of an empire, was reaching its final moment. And so was he. The battlefield stretched before him, a graveyard of warriors and ruins. The temple was nothing more than crumbling stone and burning embers, its sacred halls reduced to ash. The sky above, once painted with the glow of the Yvaria's celestial lights, was now a void of swirling darkness. The Xal'nari Overlords still stood. Its form shifted and rippled, a creature of shadows and ancient wrath. It had no body, no flesh, only that impossible void, its two piercing eyes burning straight through him. Lucas tightened his grip on the sword. His knuckles bled, his muscles screamed. He had nothing left. No strength. No energy. But still, he stood. Because if he fell now, the galaxy fell with him. The Overlord moved. A storm of black tendrils erupted, coiling toward him like the hands of death itself. Lucas reacted on instinct, the sword rose, humming in his grip one last time. The impact rippled through reality itself. For a split second, time fractured, the past, the present, and the forgotten all colliding in a single flash of memory. A battlefield 10,000 years ago. Warriors wielding the same sword, humans, standing among the stars, fighting back the tide of darkness. Their voices echoed through him. Finish what we could not. Lucas's body moved on its own. The Vaelthar ignited, its last breath funneling into his veins. His vision blurred. The sword wasn't just choosing him anymore. It was becoming him. He lunged forward. The Overlord struck. And in the space between a breath, Lucas drove the blade straight into the heart of the void. Final scene, the aftermath. Silence. The battlefield was gone. No fire. No smoke. No ruins. Just a vast emptiness, stretching endlessly. Lucas felt himself falling. His body was light, weightless, drifting between what was and what would be. The Vaelthar was gone. Its power spent. Its duty fulfilled. He had won. But victory had a price. As the darkness around him faded, he knew, he would never be remembered. His name would vanish, lost like the warriors before him. But the sword would remember. And one day, it would awaken again. For the next one. The next human. The next warrior. Lucas let out a final breath, and disappeared into legend. Final line. The blade will rest, until another warrior rises to claim it.